Over the years, emo has been called many things. Music, a fashion style, a movement that changed alternative culture forever, and shit. But did you know that back in the 2000s, people thought it was a full-blown cult? Lads, gather around because today we're yapping about emo music. More specifically, that time the world thought emo was more dangerous than swimming 30 minutes after you've eaten. Oh, quick thing, I'm not really one for plugging my own stuff, but if you're liking these videos and you want to support it, I've got memberships now. You get cool stuff like your name in the credits, early access to videos, and we've even got a Discord server where we chat about music and argue about whether I'm right or wrong and share whatever we've been working on. No pressure, but if that sounds fun, then check it out below. Right, so before we get into the nitty and gritty of it all, I think it's important we establish what emo actually is. Because depending on who you ask, it's either sad music for pansies or scary screamo shit. And somehow, they'd both be right. Okay, let's rewind. Emo didn't start with My Chemical Romance or Fall Out Boy or whatever your 2012 Tumblr dashboard looked like. Believe it or not, emo started in the hardcore punk scene, all the way back in the 1980s. It wasn't about eyeliner or studded belts, it was just punk bands playing their songs. But then, I don't know, I guess they started to feel things. One of those bands was Rites of Spring, and their singer Guy Picciuto was out here screaming about his emotions instead of like government corruption. And DC's hardcore scene hated it. At a time when hardcore had more of an aggressive, tough guy persona, this idea of screaming about your feelings was seen as quite, for lack of a better term, pussy. It showed too much vulnerability. It conflicted with hardcore's traditional values. They started calling it emotional hardcore or emo-core. Not as a cool name for a genre, but as a way of saying, look at these losers crying on stage. Picciuto detested it and has gone on record stating that he doesn't recognize emo as a genre. And ultimately they ended up splitting in 1986. Oh, and spoiler alert, the name stuck. So the 80s emo bands broke up because of course they did, but the sound kept evolving. By the 90s emo got a lot sadder, a lot softer, and way more twinkly. It wasn't about aggression anymore. Bands like Sunny Day Real Estate, American Football, and Mineral took all that emotional intensity and said, what if we played mathy guitar riffs and sang as if we were a guy that just got dumped in Wetherspoon's car park at 2 AM? It was introspective, melancholic, and in a way, more emotionally devastating than screaming your lungs out in a basement. And then the 2000s happened. Emo stopped being just a niche music genre. It became a full-on cultural movement. Bands like My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, and Taking Back Sunday took the emo sound, made it bigger, catchier, way more dramatic, and suddenly emo was on MTV, in Hot Topic, and in every MySpace bio written in alternating uppercase and lowercase letters. But here's the problem. For the first time, emo wasn't just about music anymore. It was a look. And as we've seen in basically every alternative subculture ever, when something has a look, people start freaking out. But just because your kid suddenly starts dressing in all black, dyeing their hair, and listening to emotional music, it doesn't mean you should be worried. What, do you think it's dangerous or something?
Are those strange clothes and strange music a part of a phase or something more dangerous? There is a new trend in music that has bands advocating depression and suicide. And tonight, your News Channel 3's Bob Matthews investigates whether this kind of music can be dangerous for your teenager.
Huh. So to sum up, emo started as hardcore kids being too emotional, turned into sad indie kids with twinkly guitars, and then became a full-blown cultural movement. But to the media, none of that mattered. Because by the 2000s, emo wasn't just a genre, it was a threat.
Well, tonight we have a warning about a teen phenomenon that involves, it sounds weird, self-mutilation and suicide.
And in a state where the teen suicide rate is already at an all-time high, we think this is a very important report that every parent should see. ABC4's Reed Cowan, now with us, has a special report for parents about the so-called emo culture.
By the 2000s, emo wasn't just a genre anymore. It was a look, which meant it was only a matter of time before people started freaking out about it. At first, emo was just a music scene, but then the look started taking over. Gone were the flannel shirts and oversized sweaters of 90s emo. Now if you were an emo kid in the 2000s, you had to have jet black hair, straight and stiffer than a North Korean soldier on parade. Side swept bangs covering one eye which had to have black eyeliner around it. Band tees that fit way too tight, studded belts, and of course, skinny jeans so tight they might cut off circulation. This wasn't just music fandom anymore, it was an entire identity. But when that happens, people outside the scene start to notice. Now for most of us, that was just part of the fun. But to the media, this wasn't just a bunch of teenagers being dramatic, This was a crisis. Because you see, if your kid suddenly starts dressing in all black, dyeing their hair, and listening to sad music, that clearly meant something was wrong. Forget teenage angst. This was obviously the sign of a deeper issue. Like, what if it's a cult? And that's where the panic started. The music was one thing, but once emo became something you could see, something that made kids stand out in public, it became an easy target. It started small, a few articles here and there wondering if emo was too dark or bad for mental health, but it snowballed fast. Suddenly emo wasn't just a genre, it was a threat to your child's well-being. News outlets began running stories about how emo was linked to depression, self-harm, and all sorts of moral panics. Never mind what the music and lyrical content was about. No, to the media, emo was basically a gateway drug to sadness, and God forbid teenagers have feelings. And that's when it really spiraled out of control, when emo stopped being a subculture and became a scapegoat. So how do we get from sad songs to satanic panic levels of hysteria? Well, let's talk about that.
This is more like, I love my girlfriend, it sucks that she broke up with me. Emo is more like, my girlfriend broke up with me, I'm gonna go kill myself.
How do we get from sad songs and tight jeans to people thinking emo was an actual cult? Because as much as emo was just a music scene with an unfortunate addiction to guy liner, the media decided it was something much darker. This wasn't just teenagers being angsty, this was a dangerous trend corrupting the youth. Let's start with the UK, where the media had a complete meltdown over emo. In 2008, the Daily Mail, because of course it was the Daily Mail, ran a story basically claiming My Chemical Romance for encouraging depression and self-harm. The article was titled, "Why No Child is Safe from the Sinister Cult of Emo," and wrote on the tragic death of a 13-year-old girl named Hannah Bond, who died by suicide. Instead of addressing the complex mental health issues that actually led to her death, the media decided to blame it on her love for emo music, more specifically, My Chemical Romance. The article described emo as a dangerous teenage trend, claiming it encouraged kids to self-harm as part of an identity. They even suggested that wearing black, writing sad poetry, and listening to emotional music were signs that your child was part of this so-called emo cult. This article sparked actual protests from fans who gathered outside the Daily Mail's office, holding signs like "We're not a cult." Because nothing says we're not a cult like a large organised gathering to defend your leader. While the UK's emo panic is often remembered for sensational headlines and angry parents pacing the house over My Chemical Romance, there's a darker side to the story. In 2007, the tragic case of Sophie Lancaster brought this issue to the national spotlight. Sophie and her boyfriend Rob were walking through a park in Lancashire when they were attacked by a group of teenagers, simply because of how they looked. Sophie and Rob were part of the alternative scene. Gothic, yeah, but their appearance was lumped into the same dangerous subculture that the media had been demonising for years. They were beaten so brutally that Sophie later died from her injuries after trying to protect Rob during the attack. While Sophie identified more with goth culture, her murder became a symbol for the wider alternative community, including emos, punks, metalheads, and anyone who dared to stand out. The media's relentless portrayal of these subcultures as dark, dangerous, or associated with violence didn't just create moral panic, it fueled real-world prejudice. People were targeted simply for dressing differently, for having dyed hair, piercings, or band tees. Being alternative wasn't just a fashion choice, it could be dangerous. Sophie's death led to the creation of the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, which campaigns against prejudice and violence towards people from alternative subcultures. Their work even influenced discussions around hate crime laws in the UK, arguing that attacks based on someone's appearance should be treated with the same severity as other forms. And in 2013, recording assaults on emos and other subcultures began, and it became a hate crime. While the UK's panic turned deadly because of prejudice, in Mexico that fear and hate exploded into something even bigger. Full-on riots. In 2008, emo culture was booming in Mexico, but instead of just facing judgment from parents or the media, emo kids were targeted with actual violence. It started in Querétaro, where the attackers would refer to themselves as anti-emos and would include groups of punks, metalheads, and even skinheads, as well as ordinary middle-class men. They claimed emo was inauthentic, too soft, and ruining the alternative scene. But really, it was about how emo challenged the ideas of traditional masculinity. It was emotional, vulnerable, and didn't fit the tough guy rebellious image these groups idolized. The violence spread quickly to Mexico City and beyond. Emo kids were chased, beaten, and harassed just for how they looked. They claimed emos were dressing effeminately, a provocative act for many in macho Mexico. Reality was this wasn't just about emos. It was an issue of toxic masculinity and homophobia, with attacks on emos acting as a front for deeper prejudices rooted in Mexican society. However, the emos fought back. Not with violence, but with peaceful protests. It wasn't about the music, it was about fighting for the right to live without fear. So while the UK blamed emo for corrupting kids and Mexico saw literal street riots, over in Russia they decided to just ban emo altogether. In 2008, Russian officials proposed legislation to restrict emo culture in schools and government buildings. They claimed it encouraged depression, self-harm, and antisocial behavior. According to the Moscow Times, the document described emos as typically aged between 12 and 16, wearing black and pink clothing with long black bangs that covered half the face, along with black nail polish and era eyebrow piercings. The bill also claimed that emo culture promoted a negative ideology, suggesting it encouraged depression, social withdrawal, and posed a significant risk of suicide, particularly among young women. Apparently, sad lyrics and side fringes were enough to threaten national stability. But this wasn't really about music, it was about control. Emo represented everything the Russian government didn't like: individuality, emotional vulnerability, non-conformity. So instead of addressing real issues, they tried to legislate emotions out of existence. I'm not quite sure how they expected to target the ones who had committed suicide, but they sure seemed pretty determined.
Emos are horrible! They're posers!
Emos suck my golf balls.
So after all the moral panic, media hysteria, street riots, and even government bans, what happened to emo? Did it disappear? Did it fade away like a Seeing Kids MySpace profile? Not really, no. It never died. It's done what every other musical genre has done. It evolves. Sure, the 2000s mainstream emo bands like My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, and Paramore eventually faded from the charts, but emo didn't vanish. It just went underground again, the same way it started. Those same bands just reinvented their sound before going on a hiatus, only to come back again with another new sound. In the 2010s, we saw a sort of emo revival, with bands like The Hotelier, Modern Baseball, and Joyce Manor. Old emo bands reunited once more like American football. And now in the 2020s, we're seeing a massive rise in the Midwest emo sound, with bands like Hot Mulligan and Moose Creek Park. All these bands are bringing back that raw emotional sound, just less polished and maybe more authentic. It wasn't about radio hits anymore, it was about community and expression. And even now, emo is everywhere, you just might not recognize it. Artists like Phoebe Bridgers and Soccer Mummy might not scream emo in the traditional sense, but their songwriting is just as introspective and vulnerable as the bands that pioneered the genre. In the world of rap and hip hop, artists like Lil Peep and Juice WRLD openly embraced emo aesthetics and themes, blending genres in ways no one expected back in 2008. And yes, My Chemical Romance are still selling out stadiums around the world, because it turns out it wasn't a cult. It was just a fan base. The truth is, emo never really left, because it's not just a genre, it's an outlet. A way for people, especially young people, to process emotions, connect with others, and find their place in a world that often feels overwhelming. Back in 2008, I was one of those teens that would hang out on emo forums with long black hair way before Kellen Quinn made it cool. It was an identity for me before I even really knew what an identity was. The moral panic that the media tried so desperately to portray didn't destroy emo. If anything, it made it stronger. Because when you tell people they can't express themselves, they'll just find new ways to do it. Maybe emo wasn't the dangerous cult people thought it was, but you know what's actually dangerous? The people who were so desperate to believe it was. I've been James. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed. Thanks for watching.